Did you ever, as a child, lie on your back with a friend, perhaps looking up at the clouds and telling each other what you could see as you looked at the different shapes they formed in the sky? I have a distinct memory of doing that with my best friend Claire when we were about 7 years old. We were in our side yard near the edge of the woods, but where we still had a vast amount of open sky above us. We watched as the clouds shifted gently, changing shape as they slowly crossed our field of vision. While the memory of the different things we identified is vague, I do remember that at least some of our images were religious. After all, God in some form, most likely that of an old bearded man, lived up there somewhere. And having that image of who and where God was shaped how we thought about him. He was definitely male when I was 7. And in turn, how we related to God, rather like a benevolent grandfather in the sky, who, while mostly friendly, was rather picky about certain kinds of behavior, and was, while supposedly loving, also rather distant. For I had heard in Sunday school the story of the stone tablets given to Moses, told with the aid of images on a flannel graph, and understood the commandments as a long list of rules, not all of which I understood. I also definitely heard all those "thou shalt not" in the singular, things I personally was not supposed to do. If you obeyed all the rules, then you too would someday be up in the sky with God and not down somewhere exceedingly unpleasant, burning up. And while it is true that the Hebrew is written in the singular, the word translated as law, Torah, is better understood as direction or teaching. Walter Brueggemann captures this sense in his commentary on Exodus 20 in the New Interpreter's Bible, where he says, "These commands might be taken not as a series of rules, but as a proclamation in God's own mouth of who God is and how God is to be practiced by this community of liberated slaves." It describes the practices of those in covenant with the God, faithful God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the way of life, the way of being in relationship with God. To ignore them is to wander into the ways of death instead. Thought of this way especially, they can be seen more as addressing the public ethics of a people than the concern for the private morality of individuals. The tablets themselves became symbols of that relationship, as we know, carried in the ark through all the people's years of wandering through the wilderness, and later placed in the Holy of Holies at the heart of the temple in Jerusalem. They were the locus of God's abiding presence in their midst, the sign that regardless of what might occur or they might do, God would be faithful. Through all the subsequent years and generations of exile, always there was the double theme: how shall we sing the Lord's song on an alien soil? Speaking to that sense of physical separation, and next year in Jerusalem, expressing the burning hope to once again be celebrating the festivals in the Promised Land. So here we are in Jerusalem in our gospel reading from John. It is coming close to the time of Passover, that annual festival and celebration of God's deliverance from Egypt that began that first journey to Israel and the Promised Land, all of which is focused on the temple. We see Jesus and his disciples newly arrived from Cana, where he has done the first of his signs, placing this reading at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry rather than at the end of the final journey to Jerusalem, as it is in the other 3 Gospels. We know from the beginning in John who Jesus is. Now we begin to learn all that that means. in the outer court of the temple, the only area open to Gentiles, Jesus finds not sacred space, but what looks like an open-air market. Money changers are there to allow people to exchange their Roman coins, marked with the head of the emperor, for the temple coinage, which they must have to purchase their animal offerings. The animals to be offered must be without blemish, so sellers of sacrificial animals are there as well. It would be hard for anyone coming from a distance to arrive with an unblemished animal. So all this activity was essential to the functioning of the temple, the people's worship. Yet somehow over time it had been perverted. Instead of the practices of the people represented by the ark and the temple informing how the people lived in the world, the ways of the world had become so the norm that they had invaded even into the very precincts of the temple. It is into all this activity that Jesus wades with his whip of cords, disrupting all this buying and selling, this exchange of money, overturning tables, frightening and loosing animals, sheep and cattle, not just doves or pigeons, as in the other versions of the story. It is a familiar story, but look and listen for a moment and imagine the scene, full of noise and outrage. This is Jesus as prophet, challenging the status quo, upsetting the norms of how things are done at the very center of the place that gives the people the identity they have and their connection to God. The authorities, in turn, as usual, challenge him. What sign can you show us for doing this? Curiously, they are not asking why Jesus has done this, but rather by what authority. What gives him the right to disrupt their activity they see as essential to their proper worship, but also what right has he to claim the temple as my Father's house? As he so often does, Jesus avoids answering their question and replies in a way that confuses not only the Jewish authorities, but also his disciples. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. It is only much later, we are told, after the resurrection, that they actually understand what he means. By equating himself, his very body, with the temple as the locus of God's presence, Jesus is making a radical statement at the heart of Jewish understanding. While they know that God cannot be contained in a building, they nonetheless can hear him only literally, letting them dismiss what he says as nonsense, that he can rebuild in 3 days the huge edifice that took 46 years, as we heard, to construct. For the disciples much later, for John's hearers, and for us, we are reminded that Jesus is God present among us, not merely the sign or token, but God in the flesh, not confined to a building, but living still in the midst of us, crucified and raised after 3 days. The other places besides up in the sky, or where heaven was, that I knew as a child was where God was in church. I learned that the church was God's house, built especially for us to go and visit, to worship, to give thanks, to listen to stories and sing hymns. We learned about God so that we could take God out into the world with us, being made fishers of men. And while it is still true that we gather to worship, to pray and give thanks, to be reminded of who God is and who we are as God's people, so that we can go out as God's messengers in the world, it is more than that. Despite that even one of our hymns begins, "This is the Lord's house," we, like the ancient Jewish people and those worshiping at the west wall of the temple even today, know that God cannot be confined to a place. But we too easily forget that we gather in this place not only to relearn God, but also to learn to recognize God already active and living out in the world around us, at the places where we work, in the stores where we shop, in the people we live near or pass on the street. They're ahead of us, waiting to be named and made known, if only we have eyes to see.